Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about chord symbols. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today we're talking about chord symbols, and not necessarily how to play a bunch of different chords, but deciphering what the different symbols could mean. Symbols like this, or even this. These symbols pop up in music all the time, and we probably know how to play the different shapes, but maybe we don't actually understand what's happening with the theory behind it. So today, I wanted to help us decipher those fun little hieroglyphics. In order to understand how all these chord symbols work, we first have to understand how chords work. And in order to understand how chords work, we have to give ourselves an alphabet for this language. And in Western music, that all stems from our major scale. We have to understand that a major scale is made up of relationships, meaning that each note is a specific relationship to the root note or the tonic. It's also a specific relationship between each note moving into the next one. So for instance, when we move from our first note of the scale to the second note, that is a whole step. When we move from the second note to our third note, that is a whole step again. However, once we move from the second to the third note, we get a half step in there. And the relationship for a major scale is as follows: whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now that's what it is for a major scale. With a minor scale, it's different. It looks something more like this. But like I said, our major scale is our alphabet. And this tells us that even when we're in a different key, like instead of being in C major, if we were to shift down to B flat major, we'd still be looking at whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now, before we move on, instead of using note names, what we're going to use numbers for each degree of the scale, meaning that our first note is going to be our 1, our second note is going to be our 2, our third note 3, and so on and so forth. It's important to note that the 8 in the scale is the same pitch as our 1, it's just an octave higher. It's the difference between this and this. Both are C's, one's just an octave higher. If we were to go beyond that, it would keep counting. We use these because, again, even if we change keys, we will still have those numbers and the same relationship between each number. These are what we call our scale tones. Now let's talk about basic chords. Our most basic chord is called a triad because it's made up of 3 notes. It's made up of our 1, our 3, and our 5. And that's what makes our most common chord. Our C chord is just that. And then we add on another 8. Now with guitar, it gets kind of tricky sometimes because, for instance, with our most common bar chords, it actually changes the order. Rather than being 1, 3, 5, 1, we end up with 1, 5, 8, 3, 5, and then 8 again, or 1. Even though the notes may be out of order, they are still considered just a typical major triad because all 3 of those notes exist within it and no other ones. Now, the one thing that we need to discuss is how to take that chord and make it a minor. When we have our typical triad and it's a major triad, it's based on our major scale and it goes 1, 3, 5. However, when we want to make that 1, 3, 5 minor, we actually will just drop that third note down a half step and we get a minor chord. You can do that with our bar chord again. Remember, the third of our bar chord exists on our 3rd string or our G string. And let's make it a minor. These are our 2 most typical chords. Our major chords are mostly just written as the root note of the chord. Our minor chord, we may see some variation. It could be a lowercase m, a lowercase min with a period or without, or some people even just use a minus symbol. These, in my experience, are the most common chord symbols that we see for a minor chord. Next, we're going to get into our more complex chords, and we're going to add an extra note, so we now no longer have our most basic triad of 1, 3, and 5. Our most common iteration of this comes to us in the dominant chord or the dominant 7 chord. This is typically written as the root of the note with a 7 next to it, or I have occasionally seen it written as the root note with dom and 7. This is more rare than common, though. This is probably our most common chord because we refer to it as the 5 chord or the dominant chord, and it's one of the most popular chords in all of music. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about what it means. And what it means is it's our root, our third, our fifth, and then we actually take our 7th note of the scale and flat it. So it's now going to sound like this. We see them all the time. We know with our typical bar chord shape that if we take our pinky off, it means that we're playing a dominant 7 chord. However, the reason that works is because, like I said before, this is our 1st scale degree, this is our 5th scale degree, this is our octave, and then this is our 3rd. And so when we take that octave, that's our 8, we can go 7, flat 7, and so that is why that works as a dominant 7. Now we're moving into a realm of chords that are very common in specific genres, but we see only occasionally in our more standard pop and rock movements. These are our major 7s and our minor 7s. Now a major 7 is not to be confused with a dominant 7 because they are different chords. Our dominant 7 is mostly written as just the root note and the 7, whereas our major 7 will have either an MAJ, a triangle, and very rarely, because it can get confused with the lowercase m, I have seen a capital M and then 7. The major 7 is made by taking our 1, 3, 5, and then adding the naturally occurring 7th scale degree that exists within the major 7 chord. This chord is mostly associated with jazz and bossa nova and even some R&B, although it did occur rather frequently in singer-songwriter tunes of the early to late 2000s. The next chord, as I'm sure you probably guessed, is what would be our minor 7. The chord symbol for the minor 7 is typically written as a lowercase m and a 7, a minus symbol and then a 7, or an min and 7. Now the minor 7 is going to obviously have our flat 3 like our previous minor chord did, but it will also have a flat 7. So where we typically had our 1, 3, 5, 8, we're now going to drop that 3rd to a flat 3rd, and then we're going to drop that 8 down to a flat 7. So 8, major 7, flat 7, add all the other pieces in. Therein lies our minor 7. It's important to note that when we play a lot of these chord shapes, most of the time, we're actually only going to play 4 of our guitar strings. It starts to get really muddy and just a little too much texture when we have 1, 5, major 7, 3, and then another 5. So instead, we mostly try to just stick to these 4. Next, we're going to run into something called extensions. And what those are is those are going to be our basic chord plus some other notes. So that could be something like this, an E9. Now all we have to do is remember our foundational things that we talked about. Number 1, if there's no presence of the word major or no triangle, then we know that it has to be a dominant. So where this is just E9, we know that our foundation of it is going to be a 1, 3, 5, and a flat 7. Then we're just going to add the 9. So we'll take our E major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. and we'll add that to the chord. Now, because guitar can be really muddy, and because we also only have 6 strings, we actually sometimes leave notes out and instead choose to keep notes that help qualify the chord for what it is. So rather than being a 1, 3, 5, flat, 7, 9, we typically only play this as a 1, 3, flat, 7, and 9. Well, what if it says sharp 9? This is what we refer to a lot of times as our Hendrix chord. We're just going to take that 9th scale degree and move it up 1, sharp it, raise it. Extensions can come in all shapes and sizes. The basic gist of them is that they will typically have a bass chord, like a dominant chord, or a major chord, or a minor chord, and then they will add on what notes they want you to pick. Now, if you see something like this, that's like an E13. What that means is that any of the alternating notes from the chord can exist within this chord. You can hit a 1, a 3, a 5, a flat 7, a 9, all the way up to 13. If it says add 13, that means that it just wants you to play your major chord and add a 13 to it. This is where we run into that C add 9, is we have our typical C chord, and then we add the 9, and it doesn't want any of the 7ths, it doesn't want anything else. The last thing we need to talk about are chords that alternate things. So for instance, we could see something like a minor 7, flat 5. And what that wants from us is it wants us to do our typical minor 7 chord, which as we talked about earlier would be 1, flat 3, 5, and flat 7. And in addition to that, it wants us to flat the 5 as well. So now, instead of going 1, minor 3, 5, and flat 7, we're going to flat the 5 as well. 1, minor 3, flat 5, flat 7. Typically though, we see it played like this. In addition to this, we may see symbols like our half diminished or our fully diminished. The big secret is that the half diminished is the same exact thing as a minor 7 flat 5. The fully diminished, however, takes our 1, our flat 3, our flat 5, and our flat 7, and instead flats the 7 one more time. So we end up having a 1, flat 3, flat 5, and double flat 7. It typically sounds like this. Half diminished, fully diminished. Another weird outlier that guitarists know all too well is the sus4 or the sus2. Now what we typically use it in is with our D chord. And with that, this note is our third. And so what we're doing when we have a sus4 is we're suspending the third and adding the fourth. Third, second, sus2, add the third back in, 4, all of this to say, it's all about following this process. Start with, is it a major or is it a minor? Then, does it have a 7th? And if so, is it a minor 7 or a flat 7 or a major 7? Does it have any additions like a 9 or a 13? Are any of the notes altered? Like for instance, a C minor major 7. This would be a 1, flat 3, 5, but a major 7. Now I do think it is worth noting that there are some nuances to this, especially when you start getting into the more complex chords. For instance, there's a rule in jazz that every time you see a dominant 7 chord, if your role in the band is to be the driving harmonic outliner, like a piano or a guitar, then you can really do whatever you want over the 5. You can add the 13, you can add a sharp 11, you can do a 9. It's the difference between this and this. just adds a little bit more to it. Another rule is that typically if you're going to add the 11, they would rather you do the sharp 11 or the flat 11, because an 11 is the same note as our 4 and it gets pretty crunchy. So adding in like a sharp 11 will take that edge off and add some really unique color to it. But what do you think? What are some chord symbols that you still don't understand? Where have you found the most wild chord symbols that you've ever seen? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks again so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this helps you decipher all the crazy Greek that exists out there in the world of music. And if nothing else, was just a fun little theory lesson for you. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Mac Wright. We'll see you around.